First of all, thanks all for coming. I know it was a heavy one for some people last night, so I appreciate you making it out. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about stylization for characters. And yeah, a little bit about me. My name is Michael Ollerton, and I'm a character artist here at Sumo Sheffield. I've been here for about 5 years and worked on a bunch of really cool projects. And yeah, I really love making stylized characters. So I'm looking forward to talking about that today. So a quick bit of background on kind of why I love stylization. So like many others here, I grew up watching the animated films from studios such as Disney. And I believe the artistic qualities of these films had a profound impact on me. As I grew older and more interested in pursuing art, I sought out the artists behind these films. That was when I discovered pieces like this expression sheet from Glen Keane. And I was just blown away, firstly by the artistic skill on display, but also the believability of the character. That even though this is just a bunch of lines on paper, it can feel real. And I believe that's the power of successful stylization. It's when something can feel real, even when it's so clearly exaggerated. And yeah, that's been kind of a major pursuit in my art. And yeah. So with that, I wanted to give a real quick history into kind of the art of animation. It's definitely not comprehensive, but it's just a thin slice, which I wanted to show basically to, I think there are very few art styles that have decades and decades of artists picking up the baton from the last generation and like putting their own flair and twist on it. And so I wanted to pick out a few key figures from that era and just talk about their influence. So starting way at the beginning, we have Ub Iwerks, who was kind of co-creator of Mickey Mouse. I think worked on a lot of those early shorts on his own, so it was like a real powerhouse. And yeah, this was a time when like the art style was very intentionally simplified because they were kind of working on developing a new medium. As time went on, we'd get artists that would start putting in their own artistic flair. We had people like Fred Moore, who came along and was known for his kind of innate ability to bring kind of appeal to character design. He famously redesigned Mickey Mouse kind of during the Fantasia era. And that kind of style and look of Mickey Mouse hasn't really changed since then. So you can kind of see how his fundamentals have really stuck around for a while. As time went on, we'd get people like Milt Kahl, who was in his prime during a real peak of artistic ability in animation. The level of realism and refinement was incredibly high. And most artists interested in this field heavily study his work. And then, yeah, we kind of move on to your kind of contemporary artists. So I put Glen Keane up here as he's a personal favorite of mine, but this is really, the time of the internet now, when people from all over the world can start picking up the baton and adding their own influences. And I think this is also where you see it bleeding into all other mediums now. So obviously video games is a huge one. Games like Overwatch, for example, I think have a huge influence from Disney, even if it's not explicitly said. So yeah. So why does this style work? I believe this style is so successful because there's two major pillars: a practical need to be efficient and believability, or the artist's desire for realism. So starting with why I think efficiency is so important is there's this concept in animation known as pencil mileage. And basically it's how long does it take to draw one frame? Keeping in mind that for 1 second of animation you need 24 frames, and most shots or scenes in animation are longer than 1 second. So it becomes obvious that the art style had to develop to favor clear, readable designs with reduced details and simplified anatomy. It's it becomes obvious that efficient drawing was an undeniable practical requirement. So now moving on to the next pillar, which is what I call kind of the artist's desire for realism. There's this great story that I really like from the film Snow White. A lot of the artists that worked on this film were really unsatisfied with their efforts to convey this deer. A lot of them felt that he just ended up looking like a bag of flour. Poor little guy. This frustration clearly grew and into their efforts to want to do it right on Bambi. they wanted to do better, and so they brought in artists to train them in the areas they thought they were lacking. As a result, they started to achieve something with far more realism. So while no one was coming out of Snow White and complaining about the quality of the deer, they would come out of Bambi and be amazed by the visual impact of him first learning to walk. This would not be nearly as impactful if the character wasn't designed the way he was, with his underlying skeletal structure and anatomy considered. It's successes like this in the early days of animation that I think really cemented the concept that a desire for realism is going to elevate the art style. So those are kind of my two examples of why I think this kind of art style is so successful. It's that practical need for efficiency and the artist's desire for realism and believability. So with all that, hopefully I've kind of piqued your interest in the value of this art style. And now I'm going to get into kind of the meat of the talk, which is kind of my process and techniques for stylization. I've done a lot of research into this just for my own personal development, and I'm quite excited to share some of that with you today. So kind of starting at the real beginning, I think everything in stylization, at least in this stylization, is just different ways of applying these two stylization ingredients. How much do you simplify something, and how much do you exaggerate? Now, when it comes to stylization, there's so much you can talk about, but for this talk, I'm mostly going to be concerned with shape and form. I think that's kind of one of the major areas that comes up a lot with characters. That's what I'd like to focus on. So starting with kind of shape language, again, a real bare foundational thing. Shape language is just a super helpful thing to be aware of. Like it says in the name, it's a language, and like a conventional language has a vocabulary of words. We have a vocabulary of shapes that we can use. Obviously, the square, circle, and triangle. And the more we understand a language, the easier it is to communicate. So I've had a go at designing some characters just using these archetypal conventional traits of these shapes. The reason for this is that we're all kind of subconsciously making assumptions about characters based on shape language. So the square is kind of sturdy and straight and can imply strength and stubbornness. Circles are kind of round and soft, so they can imply kindness and innocence. And triangles are kind of pointy and sharp, so they can imply unstableness and kind of commonly are associated with villains. Now, however, you could end up falling into the trap of always designing, your angry, aggressive characters as harsh shapes and your innocent characters as rounder shapes. So knowing this vocabulary can be really useful just if your intention is just to subvert expectations. So here are kind of 3 versions of a character, each using one of the shapes as a base. And I just wanted to kind of ask yourselves kind of internally, are you thinking of any specific traits with these? And if you are, that might be a sign of your own understanding of shape language, even if it's subconscious. So moving on to a more general approach to shapes, I like to call this finding the essence. And basically, I just ask myself this question: what is the subject matter essentially doing? So the process basically is observing something and just taking 5 seconds to make a note of what shapes are you seeing, defining those shapes. So here with this cloud, I had a very quick go at defining those shapes, and that becomes kind of my essence. And then from there, that becomes the blueprint to creating a stylized image. Your interpretation of that essence could be totally different, and that's fine. Just making that extra step to define it is I think, really powerful and not brought up enough. Here's another example using characters in a scene. You can see how kind of me defining that essence, kind of straighter lines for the male character and kind of curved lines leaning into that for the female, gave me an essence that I could then put into stylization. Apologies, this image is a bit darker than I was expecting. So it does, in my opinion, get a bit more complicated when it comes to people. Just defining the shapes will only get you so far before you need to dig a little deeper into what's going on underneath. This is where a little understanding of anatomy can go a long way. So next, I've tried to put together just a bunch of tips and tricks about the stylization of anatomy. So the first one that I'm sure a lot of you here are already pretty familiar with is straights versus curves. And this is really helpful as it helps avoid the feeling of static or boring human forms. A straight line next to a curve creates contrast and rhythm. And this obviously is a very graphic concept, but it does translate beautifully to 3D. So here I made a quick 3D model where the focus was kind of the straights and curves. And the reason we're doing this is because the curves are really representing muscles or fleshy parts of the body that are kind of bending and compressing and creating a round shape. Whereas straights are usually going to be the bony part of the body or a muscle that's being pulled tight. So all we're doing is taking what is existing there already and just pushing it a bit. When approaching the head, I really like to start with this thing I've been calling the rounded square. And basically, if anyone's familiar with the Loomis method of drawing a head, you kind of start with a circle, then you slice off planes, and then you add the lines. And what I'm doing is kind of skipping a few steps and getting into like defining the planes really early on. This is great for helping, orientation is already there for you, whereas you have to do far more steps with a standard circle. So again, this is just another example of finding the essence. For me, the essence of the skull is more this shape, so I really like using that. So these are some notable areas to consider when approaching the head. First, that rounded square shape I mentioned for the skull. A really great one is this kind of mask shape starting at the eyebrows. It really helps you define the sockets for the eyes to fit in. You can kind of think of that like the kind of superhero Incredibles mask. It's a really great technique for getting the eyes in. Looking at the profile, I love using these lines to help play with the shape and form of the character. So this line leading into the nose, of course the size of the eye, the line and how that connects into the neck. That is really important for how muscular or thin you want a character, and the same for the line defining under the chin. So kind of using all these lines in combination is really powerful to play with the features of the face. So yeah, a final note I'd like to talk about the face is how ratios can play into the age and feeling of a character. Some stereotypical choices are larger forehead and bigger eyes, kind of for a feeling of youth and cuteness, whereas a smaller forehead and smaller eyes can feel more adult, more mature. Again, similar to shape language, I don't like to think of these as like absolute rules, but it's powerful vocabulary to be aware of. The torso is a very large part of the body in terms of real estate that you need to draw or model. And so I like to think of it in the simplest terms I can, which is a solid, flexible solid with all the deformation contained in the flexible area. The reason for this is that those simple box shapes are actually defining key underlying structures of the torso. And that is the rib cage and pelvis, which can't deform, but are connected by a spine which can bend and twist. Another great observation of the torso is that kind of natural symmetry and division that you get, which kind of extends to the whole body, but I think is obviously very evident in the torso. Once you have some basic construction, these are some of the areas I like to play around with when considering stylization. First, the curve of the lat muscle. A common artistic decision for me is to really exaggerate that overhang. I really like that. The next is kind of the bottom of the rib cage, especially on slimmer builds, that can protrude out and be a really nice form. Another is the external oblique, which attaches at the top of the rib cage and down into the pelvis, and yeah, again, is another really noticeable silhouette to play with. And of course, the shape of the stomach, which can be defined either by the abdominal muscles or just the curve of the stomach. Again, playing around with all these combinations of curved lines and shapes that you come across on the torso can create really appealing and beautiful varied body shapes. Looking at the arm, I again really like to think in just the simplest terms I can. So 2 cylinders, and then refining that a bit more, I break the top 2 into 3 shapes and the bottom one into 1. And the reason why I don't break the bottom one into too many is even though the forearm is incredibly complex in terms of all the internal muscles there, I still think the essence for me can be quite comfortably defined with just 1 cylinder with a bit of tapering going on. Now, in terms of stylization, these are areas that I really like to play around with. I really like to exaggerate the curve of the deltoid leading into the straight of the bicep. You can see the tapering I mentioned on the forearm and how I really push the form of the upper forearm leading into the elbow. The bicep and tricep are really awesome because they're a perfect example of straight versus curve. and they'll actually alternate positions depending on the flexion or extension. That's really cool. Yeah, so here you can see some body variation using all those stylization elements I kind of mentioned. And the key is really just to maintain that balance of curves to straights to curves. Moving on to the legs, again, same as the arms, 2 cylinders work really nicely. And then getting a bit more refined, the legs have a really beautiful flow and rhythm. You can trace an S line that goes starting at the hip, across the thigh, around the knee, and down across the shin, which is this really awesome, beautiful rhythm. There's actually a muscle called the sartorius muscle, which richly wraps around that thigh and yeah, follows that line perfectly. Another great point about the legs is this noticeable, where all the protruding forms are, kind of have a counter form at about a 45-degree angle, which I again think leads to this kind of a pleasing flow and volume to the legs. And then again, yeah, just to show some body variation. Again, all these things I mentioned about the flow and curves are all still evident regardless of muscle definition or body weight. So moving on to the hand. Now, the hand is an incredibly complex and intricate part of the human body. It could easily take up its own talk just on that subject alone. So what I wanted to focus on here was an observation I made studying Milt Kahl, one of the artists I mentioned at the start. And it's something I don't think I've really seen called out too much, but I think is really cool. And it's basically where he chooses to connect the wrist. So quite a common choice is to connect in the center here. And that's totally fine and valid, but what he chose to do specifically is connect it right at the edge here. And if you observe your own arms, you can kind of see you're exaggerating this straight line right from the elbow up across the hand and up to the little finger. And it also really, because of that, really exaggerates the overhang on the other side leading into the thumb. This is just a really awesome example of him observing what was in real life and pushing it. And because of that, it also encourages this great, again, straights versus curves, or more in this sense, simple shapes versus complex shapes. And then finally, with the foot, I think the foot can be, a lot of people can overthink the foot because of its similarities to the hand. However, I think the more general requirement of the foot is just to be that solid base and foundation to plant your whole body. So for me, I often only think of the foot in these 3 shapes. This main shape, where I'm kind of considering the arches of the foot. This smaller volume, where I kind of just combine all the toes into one mass. And then the big toe, which I kind of keep separate because it kind of has a bit more articulation than the rest. Apart from that, then I just kind of make note of the different silhouette changes that you can get. So from the front, I kind of like to think of it as this overall triangle shape. And yeah, from the bottom, again, you can see that example of the straights versus curves. So it comes into play so much in the human form. So that was a really kind of head to toe, just a bunch of stylization tips you could consider when approaching anatomy. The next thing I want to talk about is clothing. Now, when it comes to the anatomy of clothing, there is so much of specific types of folds, but really what it comes down to is these 2 main concepts of the folds, either a tension fold or a compression fold. And a tension fold is basically when the fabric is being pulled and stretched tight by a point of tension, which could be an external object, whereas a compression fold is when 2 opposing forces are kind of gently pressing the shape. In fact, the own weight of the fabric could be one of those opposing forces that's just kind of naturally creating a compressed fold. My approach for clothing is first to observe and make note of these 2 types of folds. And then secondly, I'll just make note of possible areas to exaggerate the silhouette. Here's a second example of this, and this one's really great because you can see the loose fit of the leather jacket. So it's predominantly compression folds. So the heavy leather is kind of bending and buckling under its own weight, whereas the tighter fit of the jeans is predominantly the tension fold. So it's being pulled more tight around the form. That's really nice as it shows them both kind of clearly, but also separately. So once I have those main observations, they become a really great blueprint if you put them together. And then that's kind of all you need to start stylizing. And then when it comes to stylization, it's just reducing the quantity of folds and just pushing those silhouette changes. And yeah, when it comes to folds, I usually think less is more. If you can get away with 1 instead of 3 or 4, that usually looks nicer for this kind of style. So next is an approach to hair. that I think is really cool, thinking about the concept of a barcode. So I learned this from an artist about how a barcode is a collection of lines with varying thickness and space from each other. And that can be a really helpful idea to keep in mind when approaching hair. Hair can get very messy very quickly, as defining all the hair strands can get noisy and be a high frequency detail, and can be in conflict with the overall style. So here, I wanted to show a character where I first just tried to keep the flow and everything, but just try and define all the lines to show how it's looking a bit too noisy and doesn't quite fit the style. And then I tried to do an approach where I was thinking about that concept of the barcode with the varying spaces and forms. And hopefully you can see how I was a lot more selective in my choice and placement of lines. And then that becomes a great foundation to build in 3D. Again, I wouldn't even know where to start trying to define that other one, but with this I know the forms and shapes I can sculpt. So that's a really cool way. And yeah, it's not exclusive to hair. I think it can really apply to any subject matter that has a high frequency detail. So here I took a bush kind of full of leaves and then did an approach on it where I applied the barcode and considered more the spacing and placement. And I was able to imply that this is a bush full of leaves without having to define every single leaf. I think this is a great argument for the efficiency this approach provides also if we think back to how efficiency is just an important part of this style. So that's kind of all the techniques I kind of have compiled for this talk. But I appreciate they're kind of isolated, so I wanted to kind of put them all together and show you that whole approach applied to a character. So I took an iconic character that I think everyone knows, and I'm going to do an attempt of making him into this style. So first, making all those kind of observational notes for myself, kind of the flow, lines of action, possible areas I might do some straight versus curves. I made a note of kind of the square shape of his haircut, as I thought that might be a fun place to play around with. Then I move on to kind of the more basic anatomy. Again, nothing too complex, but just to lay down some of that foundation. Han Solo is quite an average build, so I didn't want to overly push him in a way that felt like it wasn't in conflict with how he actually looks. I didn't want to change it too far, but I did exaggerate the head and hands a bit and widen the stance a bit as well. From there, I kind of did my pass of making note of those clothing folds, making notes of the silhouette changes, and then doing a rough pass where I'm kind of exaggerating that silhouette. And at this point, I'm kind of reducing a lot of the details, taking things out of kind of the belt and the gun, ignoring things like pockets on the vest. And from there, I can finally layer in this kind of clean path. I can think about applying the barcoding to the hair. And yeah, then with splash of color, that's kind of my attempt at a character in this art style. And then just for fun, that's him also in 3D. So you can kind of see all those same things I mentioned are there on display. You can see how I was very selective with the folds, considered the silhouette changes and the flow, the widened stance, and yeah, that's pretty much everything I've got for today. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, I can try to answer them. Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know if they're making it available, but I can stick it on somewhere for people. Absolutely. Yeah. Very much. Yeah. Anything else? Yep. Yeah. No. Yeah. It was. Yeah. My point was never to say that it was that wasn't also a reason. I think it came, or the discussions came about because you couldn't spend forever drawing. At least in the earlier days, obviously, 2D animation isn't the only way we're using this style now. But I just felt that was an area where that decision had to be that way, which I just wanted to highlight. But yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the reason I do it is because I like it. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I've been drawing and been in art for as long as I remember. So kind of a bit of everything. I think I've had a passion for kind of that Disney style and stuff for a long time. So that's always been there. But yeah, in terms of training and stuff, I've looked at a lot of realistic stuff and learned from those sides as well. And then also, yeah, stylized. So kind of everything, yeah. Yeah. Any more questions or? Not maybe about a week of is probably an average time. The sculpts could be longer, though I'm usually pretty messy, so I'm not retopologizing all the time because I'm bad. But yeah, a week every now and then. Yeah, but yeah. That's it. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was real fun to put this all together and show it off. So yeah, really appreciate it.